Everyone thought Lady Eleanor's death was a simple tragedy, just an unfortunate accident. But the night her body was found, her room was locked from the inside, and yet a single page from her diary was missing. The question isn't who killed her. The question is, who was really in that room that night? That autumn morning carried a chill that bit at the skin, a sharp reminder that summer had long since died. The village of Ravenshade sat beneath a sky caught between grey and blue, its cobbled streets still glistening from last night's rain. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, dissolving into the crisp air. A mother scolded her child for running too far ahead. A dog barked at nothing. An old shopkeeper polished his window with slow, deliberate strokes, as if the entire village were under silent scrutiny. But today, it was not the village that was being watched. On the hill, just beyond the village, Blackwood Manor stood like a forgotten relic, its ivy-clad walls looming over Ravenshade like a stern sentinel. For centuries it had been home to wealth and whispers, to scandals that had never quite settled into dust. And today, it housed something colder than its stone walls. The body of Lady Eleanor Blackwood was found just after dawn, seated in her grand library, head tilted ever so slightly, as if she had merely drifted off to sleep. But her eyes, glassy and unseeing, told another story. In one hand, a letter, its edges crumpled as though clutched in a moment of desperation. By her feet, a delicate porcelain teacup lay shattered, its contents staining the rug in a dark crimson bloom. A few strands of chestnut hair, unnaturally severed, gleamed in the dim light. And on the far wall, a single word had been written in smudged ink: confess. The first whispers of murder rippled through Ravenshade before noon. By midday, it was in every mouth, slipping through cracks in fences and weaving between market stalls. The butcher abandoned his work to speculate darkly about money and betrayal. The baker muttered about old family curses, and outside the tailor's shop, a woman whispered, it must have been him, always lingering around the manor, too close to Lady Eleanor, too familiar. At the heart of it all, Inspector Graves stood before Blackwood Manor's great doors, jaw set, coat drawn tight against the wind. The air felt different here, too still, too expectant. As he stepped inside, the scent of aged wood and dying embers wrapped around him like something alive. The library door groaned open beneath his touch, revealing a scene that felt less like a crime and more like an unfinished story. Something was missing, something had been taken. Across the village, inside the dim light of the brass kettle tea shop, a woman stirred her tea with slow, thoughtful movements. Miss Abigail Harrow had lived in Ravenshade for decades, her presence as unassuming as the lace curtains that framed the shop windows. She was known for her quiet observations, her sharp memory, and the uncanny way she could see patterns where others saw chaos. She listened, she watched, and then with the faintest of smiles she whispered to herself, "The killer is already watching, and this is just the beginning." The morning air in Gravesend Hollow carried a peculiar bite, the kind that seeped into bones and settled like an unspoken warning. The village, veiled in mist, looked like something half forgotten, a place caught between time and memory. Cobbled streets, slick from last night's rain, twisted like veins through the heart of the town, leading toward places where secrets sat heavy. Smoke curled from chimneys in thin, wavering tendrils, vanishing into the bleak sky. A lone dog barked into the silence. The butcher, lost in thought, wiped his cleaver with slow, deliberate strokes. And behind the warped glass of Bellamy's corner shop, old Mr. Hewitt polished his windows, not for cleanliness, but as if preparing for inspection. But Gravesend Hollow wasn't under investigation, not officially, not yet. Inside the hollow hearth tea room, the brass bell over the door gave a sharp clang as Mrs. Rosalind Fairchild swept inside, her coat still damp from the clinging fog. Her face, lined with years of both kindness and curiosity, was set in a tight expression, lips pursed as if they could snap from the tension. The scent of lavender and something bitter trailed after her. She leaned in, whispering to Miss Constance Abbott, the tea-room's ever-watchful owner, whose 74 years had only sharpened her gaze. "Terrible business," Mrs. Fairchild breathed, voice barely above the hush of the room. Miss Abbott, spoon poised over her untouched tea, lifted a brow. She already knew. She always did. "Lady Eleanor Hargreaves," Mrs. Fairchild continued, eyes darting to the windows, watching the creeping mist. "Dead, in her own study. The police are everywhere." The spoon fell with a sharp clink. "Dead?" Miss Abbott echoed, though it was hardly a question. "Mrs." Fairchild cast a quick glance over her shoulder before lowering her voice further. "Not just dead, murdered." The word murder snapped through Gravesend Hollow like the crack of a dropped plate. By midday it was everywhere, slipping between alleyways, curling around doorways, carried in the breath of every whisper. The postman abandoned his route to linger in hushed conversations. The blacksmith, hands still smeared with soot, muttered darkly about debts unpaid and promises broken. Outside the tailor's shop, a woman whispered, "It must have been him." He was always near her, watching. At the heart of it all stood Hargreaves Manor, a towering relic at the village's edge, its ivy-clad facade glaring down at the world with a cold, unblinking stare. Inside, the study was undisturbed, except for what mattered most. A porcelain teacup lay shattered upon the Persian rug, its contents spilled in a deep stain that darkened like drying blood. The air smelled of old parchment, ink, and something faintly metallic. The fire had long since died, leaving the room cold despite the heavy velvet drapes. On the polished oak desk, a half-open letter remained, its fine edges marred by something darker than ink, and on the floor, near the heavy leather chair where Lady Eleanor had once sat, a single strand of hair, chestnut, cut clean, placed deliberately. Inspector Jonas Harrow stood at the desk, fingers hovering just above the paper, as if the ink might shift and tell him what he needed to know. His coat smelled of rain, his hat still damp from the mist outside, but his mind was already 10 steps ahead. "The killer was precise," he murmured. "Deliberate. This wasn't a crime of passion." Across the village green, beneath the skeletal arms of a long-dead oak, Sir Reginald Hawthorne stood with his coat drawn tight, his expression carved from something harder than grief. His gaze flickered between the manor and the gathering murmurs, aware of every glance, every suspicion. Across from him Dr. Whitmore, a lifelong friend and occasional adversary in both chess and gin, watched with careful eyes. "Keep your head, Reginald," he said quietly. "I didn't kill her," Reginald snapped, then ran a hand through his graying hair. His voice softened, wearied. "God help me, Whit, I didn't." Whitmore sighed, gaze drifting to the manor's towering frame. "I believe you, doesn't mean they will." Inside the hollow hearth, a woman stirred her tea with slow, deliberate movements. Miss Violet Arkwright, unassuming and quiet, had spent decades perfecting the art of watching. To most she was nothing more than a kindly old woman, with a fondness for weak Earl Grey. They never noticed how her sharp eyes missed nothing. Watching people, she always said, was like knitting. If you took enough stitches, paid close enough attention, a pattern would always emerge. And this morning, as she watched the village twist itself into whispers, she could see it. The pattern, the first stitch had been threaded, and whoever had pulled the needle was still watching. The study at Blackthorn Manor was a sanctuary of dust and whispers, where secrets clung to the air like the scent of old parchment. Heavy mahogany shelves loomed, their spines worn with time and use, and a single oil lamp burned low, casting flickering shadows that danced like ghosts on the velvet-draped walls. The late Lady Evelyn Blackwood had spent many evenings here, composing letters on cream-colored stationery, with the precision of a woman who understood the weight of every word. Now that same desk stood undisturbed, except for the single sheet of paper that lay at its center. Inspector Harrington, a man of rigid posture and keener instincts, slid on his gloves with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate incision. His sharp gaze settled on the letter, its ink dark and deliberate. "To my dearest Evelyn," it read, the penmanship elegant yet oddly strained. "Each day without you is torment. I long for your voice, your touch. If the world stands between us, then the world be damned." A love letter on the surface, yet something about it felt off. Too precise, too intentional. Beside him Constable Reeves, young, eager and slightly out of breath, shifted awkwardly. "Quite passionate, sir." His uniform, a size too snug, strained against his shoulders as he passed the inspector a pair of tweezers. Harrington lifted the letter carefully, his trained eye noting the faint pressure marks beneath the ink, the way certain letters curled unnaturally. Across the room, in a high-backed chair near the window, Miss Eleanor Gray sat with quiet poise, knitting needles clicking steadily. "People often borrow from fiction when reality is inconvenient," she murmured without looking up, her silver-threaded hair catching the dim light. "A confession, you think?" Reeves asked. "Or a deception," she countered. By the cold hearth, Lord Sebastian Whitmore, Evelyn's rumoured suitor, stood rigid, his face drawn with disbelief. "This is absurd," he said, his voice controlled but edged with tension. "I never wrote that letter." "Funny," Harrington mused. "Your name's at the bottom." Whitmore's jaw clenched. "Forgery." Miss Gray's eyes flickered over the page as it passed through Harrington's gloved fingers. "Curious," she murmured. The inspector raised a brow. "What is?" She tapped her knitting needle against the page as if conducting an invisible symphony. "See the flourishes here, the exaggerated loops on the ye and gok. Handwriting tells stories of its own. Some embellish when they wish to impress, others when they wish to deceive." "I thought fancy writing was just fancy writing," Reeves mumbled. Miss Gray smiled faintly. "And sometimes a locked door is just a door, but sometimes it's hiding something behind it." A cough from the doorway. Mr. Pembroke, the manor's clerk, thin and nervous, adjusted his spectacles. "Inspector, I keep records of all correspondence. Lady Evelyn's personal letters were written on blackwood ivory stock." He hesitated, then tapped the letter. "This is Somerset linen weave, a completely different supplier." A silence settled, thick and waiting. Whitmore exhaled sharply. "So now my taste in paper makes me a murderer." Harrington's lips pressed into a thin line. "No one's convicted, but a love letter turns up the day after Evelyn's death, and your name is on it. That's more than unfortunate." Outside, the autumn wind rattled the window panes, branches scratching against the glass with a sound like desperate fingers. Miss Gray folded the letter carefully, running a delicate finger along the edge. "People lie, Inspector," she said softly. "But paper rarely does." Harrington exhaled through his nose. "We'll see." He turned to Whitmore, his voice crisp. "For now don't leave town." A bitter laugh. "And where exactly would I go?" Whitmore's gaze darkened. "Hell's already overcrowded." Later that evening, alone in his dimly lit study, Whitmore sat at his own desk, a space far less grand than Evelyn's, but steeped in its own somber history. A single lamp cast pools of amber light, illuminating the letters scattered before him, his letters, his handwriting. The loops were tighter, the strokes less dramatic. No flourishes, no theatre. He reached into his coat pocket, fingers brushing the folded letter that bore his name, but none of his words. A confession in ink, a trap set with precision. Outside, the manor stood silent, save for the wind's whisper and the distant echo of a mystery far from solved. The wind rattled the shutters, a persistent skeletal tapping against the glass, as if something unseen begged for entry. Inside, the parlour of Ashworth Manor was wrapped in the hush of regret, thick and clinging, settling into the corners like dust that refused to be swept away. Lord Edwin Blackwell exhaled, rubbing his temple, the weight of accusation settling onto his bones like a second skin. Somewhere in the shadows beyond this room, someone was smiling, someone who had written his name in ink thick as guilt. Down in the heart of Ravengate, where the cobbled streets swallowed secrets and whispered them back in the hush of gaslight, the Hollow and Finch Tea Room was the kind of place where gossip steeped as strong as the Assam. Floral wallpaper in muted violets curled slightly at the edges, lace curtains framed windows smudged with the fingerprints of time, and the scent of bergamot and burnt sugar hung in the air, mingling with the low murmur of hushed voices. The room was warm, inviting, but not comforting. Not today. At her usual corner table, nestled half in shadow, Miss Eleanor Graves let her tea cool, untouched. The delicate cup sat on a saucer lined with the faintest hairline crack, unnoticed by most, but not by her. Her fingers, nimble and precise, worked at her knitting with rhythmic efficiency, not creating anything useful, just looping stitches for the sake of movement while her ears remained keen. She had learned long ago that people thought talking to themselves wasn't talking at all. But oh, the things people said when they thought no one was listening. "I heard," whispered Mrs. Redfern, her voice barely louder than the scrape of silverware, "that Lady Isabel's will leaves Ashworth Manor to that nephew of hers, the American." "Hardly American," scoffed Mrs. Pemberley, adjusting the lace at her wrist. "He was born here, just took to living abroad." "Well, that's as good as foreign to me." Miss Graves smiled faintly, counting stitches. 29, 30. The bell above the door jingled, and though not everyone turned their heads, everyone noticed. Lady Vivian Hargrove entered like the first cold snap of autumn, sharp, crisp, deliberate. Her hat, deep navy with a feather that sloped just so, was worn at an angle that made it seem as if it had always belonged there, part of her as much as her ice-pale eyes. She did not scan the room, not obviously, but her gaze swept over Miss Graves in a way that dismissed her entirely. Without a word, she moved to a booth, peeling off her gloves, pale kid leather, the kind that only truly expensive hands ever wore. She did not order tea, she ordered black coffee, a statement in itself. Not 2 minutes later, Jonathan Hale arrived. His suit was clean but well worn, shoes polished, but only just enough. He was a man who took care but not pride. His eyes flicked over the tea room, pausing when they landed on Lady Vivian, and for the briefest second something passed between them. He hesitated, then took a table near, but not next to hers, close enough for conversation if welcomed, distant enough for plausible deniability. "Odd pair," Mrs. Pemberley murmured, just loud enough to be overheard. Hale's mouth quirked, whether at the remark or at some bitter thought, Miss Graves couldn't tell. His fingers flexed slightly, a nervous tick, or perhaps just the cold. His gaze lingered on the sugar bowl a second too long, not reaching for it, just considering. Then, another arrival quieter. Miss Penelope Reed, young, unassuming, the kind of woman who could pass unnoticed if she wished. She slipped into a chair by the window, her dress a modest blue serge, a satchel clutched close. She ordered chamomile, her fingers resting lightly on the rim of her cup, and then Lady Vivian spoke. "It's unfortunate," she murmured, her voice like silk stretched thin, "how some men never learn caution in matters of the heart. Edwin always did live too dangerously." Hale stirred his tea, slow, deliberate. His eyes met hers. "And you," he mused, "were above such foolishness." A smile, the kind that never reached the eyes. "I have always been practical, not loyal, not kind, not honest. Practical people made for the most dangerous suspects." "I still don't believe he killed her," Penelope said suddenly, the words escaping before she seemed to decide whether she meant to speak them. Her cheeks colored as she glanced away, fingers tightening on her cup's handle. "Lord Edwin isn't like that." Lady Vivian turned her gaze on her, slow and measured, the way one might regard a moth that had unwittingly landed on a flame. "How touching," she mused. "Loyalty is such a quaint thing," Hale chuckled. though there was no humor in it. Quaint wouldn't be my word of choice. The tea room settled into an uneasy quiet. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour 4 o'clock. Shadows stretched long over the cobblestones, bending and twisting, making the world look just a little older, a little sadder. Miss Graves set her knitting down. 32 stitches, the same number of steps from the manor's front hall to Lady Isabel's study. A small detail, but details mattered, and somewhere far from the warmth of the tea room, someone was smiling in the dark. The rain had come early that evening, a fine mist at first, then a steady, unrelenting downpour that made the cobbled streets of Bramblewick slick and treacherous. Gas lamps flickered behind their glass enclosures, casting long shivering shadows against the buildings, old stone, weathered brick, all soaked in the weight of time, and something else, something more insidious. At the heart of it all, Blackthorn Manor stood as it always had, silent, imposing, a monument to secrets better left buried. And somewhere inside, in a room too grand for the sorrow it held, Lady Eleanor Henshaw lay cold and still, the last vestiges of life long stolen from her fragile form. Inspector Howard Graves stood by the fireplace, its embers dying, much like the woman in the center of the room. His sharp eyes roved over every detail, the overturned glass near the writing desk, the half-written note still clutched in her lifeless fingers, the faint scent of lavender masking something far more acrid. Poison, most likely. A quiet, deliberate death. Not an accident, not despair, murder. Across from him, Miss Evangeline Harper sat with her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, watching. She was a woman accustomed to being overlooked, dressed in a modest grey ensemble that made her blend into the room's heavy shadows. But her mind was sharp, sharper than the inspector would care to admit. "The ink is fresh," she murmured, breaking the silence, "and the words are careful, as if written under duress." She leaned forward, pointing a delicate finger at the note. "I fear I have made a grave mistake. Such an unfortunate choice of words." Howard sighed, rubbing his temple. "You think she was forced to write it?" "I think," Evangeline said, voice even, "that someone wanted it to look that way." The door creaked open, and in stepped Sir Reginald Henshaw, Eleanor's husband, his usually impeccable attire slightly rumpled. His face bore the exhaustion of a man drowning in accusations. "This is absurd," said, voice tight. Eleanor was fragile. She often spoke of regrets. "You can't twist her final words into some grand conspiracy." Evangeline lifted a brow, "And yet, her letterhead is missing from the desk. Only a single sheet, written too hastily, without the usual embellishments. Tell me, Sir Reginald, does your wife often write her most private thoughts on borrowed paper?" His jaw clenched, but before he could reply, another voice cut through the thick tension. "Perhaps because she never wrote it at all." All heads turned toward the doorway, where Miss Penelope Wright stood, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands twisting at the hem of her shawl. She had been Eleanor's maid, her confidant, and she knew things she perhaps should not have. "Eleanor didn't write that," Penelope whispered, stepping inside, her boots leaving damp prints against the Persian rug. Her hand was steadier, her lines cleaner. This is someone else trying to be her." A chill settled over the room, the kind that had nothing to do with the dying fire. Howard straightened, eyes narrowing. "And who, Miss Wright, would have reason to forge a dying woman's words?" Penelope hesitated, then flicked her gaze towards Sir Reginald. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but Evangeline saw it. She saw everything. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault on the manor's windows, each drop a whispered secret, each gust of wind a warning. Somewhere, hidden in the depths of Blackthorn Manor, the truth lurked, waiting to be unraveled, and someone, somewhere in the dark, was praying that it never would be. The soft morning light crept through the old cobblestone streets of Blackthorn village, stirring the whispers of secrets long buried. The air was damp, laced with the scent of rain-soaked earth and burning wood from distant chimneys. Lady Eleanor Blackthorne's murder was still a mystery, one that refused to stay silent. A heavy mist clung to the towering silhouette of Blackthorne Manor, its grand bell striking 7:30 a.m. with a solemn echo. Inside, in a lavish drawing room adorned with mahogany furniture and crystal chandeliers, the air was thick with unspoken words. Miss Evangeline Harper, a renowned but reclusive novelist, tapped her fingers against the armrest of her chair, her dark brown eyes gleaming with the thrill of a mystery unfolding before her. Sir Reginald Henshaw, once Eleanor's closest confidant, clutched a whiskey glass with trembling hands. Penelope Wright, the quiet librarian, sat in the corner, her fingers locked tightly together, as if she were holding on to something much heavier than mere worry. Inspector Howard Graves stood in the center of the room, his sharp gaze sweeping over the gathered faces. "Forgery requires two things," he said slowly, "skill and intent, and I believe we have plenty of both here." A heavy silence fell. Evangeline's lips curled into a small smile. "Are you suggesting Eleanor's will was forged?" Inspector Graves flipped open an old file. "That's just one part of it," he said. "But what about the letter she wrote the night she was killed? The one that said, 'If anything happens to me, know that it was someone within these walls.'" The color drained from the faces in the room. Sir Reginald slammed his glass down. "Nonsense." Eleanor had a dramatic flair. She enjoyed making everything seem grander than it was. "But Inspector," Penelope's voice was quiet but steady, "if the letter was forged, then why stop at a simple warning? Why didn't the killer directly accuse someone?" Graves studied her carefully. "Maybe because this is all a game. Someone is setting someone else up." His fingers brushed against the envelope containing the letter. The ink was still fresh, but something was wrong. Eleanor Blackthorne never used blue ink. Evangeline leaned forward, sipping her tea. "How intriguing, Inspector. So you believe this isn't just a murder, it's a carefully orchestrated trap?" Graves exhaled, his mind working through the pieces. "I believe the killer is still here, and the game they started is slipping out of their control." A sudden crash echoed through the manor. The antique mirror in the drawing room had shattered to the floor. Over the sound of breaking glass, something else was unmistakable, the soft scrape of hurried footsteps, someone trying to slip away. "Stop!" Graves barked, rushing toward the corridor, but by the time he reached it, only a dark shadow was vanishing through the back passage, and on the floor, one clue remained, a small bottle of blue ink, smeared with a single fingerprint. Somewhere in the shadows, someone was rubbing their fingers anxiously, heart pounding, whispering to themselves, "Just one more night, just one more night, and the truth will never come out." The night settled over Blackwood Village like a predator, its silence broken only by the restless sigh of the wind through twisted trees. The old manor at the hill's edge loomed against the bruised sky, its windows flickering with the uncertain glow of candlelight. Lady Eleanor Ashford was dead, found sprawled in her study, a shattered glass of brandy staining the Persian rug beneath her. The whispers began before the body had even cooled. Amelia Hartley, sharp-eyed and sharper-witted, adjusted her gloves as she stepped through the manor's heavy oak doors. She wasn't one for dramatics, but tonight, even she could sense the weight of something unspoken pressing against the grand walls of Blackwood Hall. Secrets here were as thick as the dust in forgotten corners, and she had every intention of uncovering them. In the drawing room, the family had gathered. Sir Reginald Ashford, his face lined with grief, or something resembling it, stared into his untouched drink. Beatrice Holloway, Eleanor's oldest friend, sat rigidly, her fingers worrying the lace edge of her handkerchief. And then there was Theodore Finch, the family solicitor, his expression unreadable, but his fingers tapping an unsteady rhythm against the armrest of his chair. A man with too much to hide. "The letter," Amelia murmured, letting the words drift like smoke into the air. "A rather dramatic thing to leave behind, don't you think?" Reginald flinched. Beatrice's gaze snapped to her. Finch, however, only smiled, too smooth, too practiced. Lady Eleanor was a woman of sentimentality, Finch said carefully. Perhaps it was a final confession, a regret, or a warning, Amelia countered. The ink was fresh, the wording precise, but the intent, that was something else entirely. A gust of wind rattled the window panes, and in the flickering light, Amelia caught it, the briefest flicker of fear in Beatrice's eyes, the tightening of Finch's jaw, the way Reginald's hand twitched toward his glass. She leaned back, tapping her fingers against the armrest. Forgery requires two things, skill and intent. And whoever forged that letter had both. The fire crackled, filling the silence with its own whispers. Outside, the village streets lay empty, but Amelia knew better. Somewhere out there in the shifting dark, the truth was waiting. And soon, it would no longer be hidden. The wind slithered through the village like a whisper, carrying secrets no one dared to speak. Beneath the silver-streaked sky, the trees stood skeletal, their twisted limbs reaching like desperate hands toward a truth just beyond their grasp. Miss Adelaide Verner paused by the old village sign, its letters worn but stubborn, clinging to history like ivy clung to the crumbling edges. Welcome to Black Hollow. The name itself tasted of something forgotten, something best left undisturbed. And yet, disturbance was precisely why she was here. The death of Lord Everston had rattled the town, his body discovered in the study, a glass of untouched brandy by his hand, a letter half burned in the hearth. The whispers had started before the body had cooled, twisting into speculation, threading through the narrow lanes and candlelit parlors. Miss Verner had seen it before, grief curdled into gossip, fear dressed in the guise of propriety. But this was different. This town breathed its secrets too easily, and the people wore their denials like ill-fitted coats. Some sagged under the weight of guilt, others bristled with the sharp edges of concealed motives. She knew the patterns. Money, love, pride, fear, they wrapped around murder like vines around a rotting structure, and here, the roots ran deep. She turned her gaze toward Everston Manor, a monolith of stone and shadow sitting at the edge of the village, its towering chimneys exhaling the last breaths of a dying fire. The house loomed, silent, indifferent. But houses, she had learned, had memories of their own. Footsteps that had no owners, doors that whispered open when no one stood near. Places like these did not simply witness tragedy, they absorbed it, held it tight within their walls. And inside, among the heavy drapes and polished floors, someone knew more than they were saying. Someone had walked the halls that night. Someone had stood in the flickering firelight and watched Lord Everston take his last breath. Her gloved fingers tightened around the small notebook she carried. The pages inside held more than names. They held echoes. Lady Everston, grief-stricken or simply waiting for the dust to settle. The loyal maid, Eleanor, whose devotion seemed almost rehearsed. And Victor Kane, the family lawyer, who had arrived too quickly after the news broke, his gaze too careful, his condolences just a shade too polished. Then there was the letter, the half-burned truth, its few surviving words clinging to the edges of paper like ghosts resisting the flame. He knows. Who was he, and what did he know that was worth killing for? A dog barked in the distance, the sharp sound knifing through the thickening mist. She did not flinch. A moment later, the village church bell chimed the hour, a slow measured toll that settled like a heartbeat beneath the hush. The town waited, watching from behind lace curtains and shuttered windows. They wanted this over, a clean explanation, an easy culprit. But Miss Verner knew better. The simplest answers were often the most dangerous lies. Adjusting her scarf, she stepped forward, her boots crunching against the frost-kissed path. Whatever secrets lay buried here, whatever truths had been stitched into the fabric of this place, she would find them. And once a thread was pulled, the whole tapestry would unravel. Lips pressed tight as though sealing away a truth too dangerous to speak, Eleanor Braithwaite adjusted her apron with a clipped nod. "You'll find what you need in the East Wing," she said, voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Not much use to anyone these days." Lady Everleigh preferred her West parlor, said the East Wing was full of drafts and other things. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes, but Adelaide Thorne had spent years peeling back facades. She recognized fear even when dressed in polite dismissal. "Ghosts don't write letters," she murmured. Eleanor didn't smile, wouldn't be so sure. The corridor yawned ahead, lined with paintings of unsmiling ancestors, their oil-painted eyes flat and knowing. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and time-worn secrets, and the candlelight flickered against the cracked wallpaper, casting long shadows that slithered like things alive. One painting caught her eye, a woman with high cheekbones and cold, pale eyes. A resemblance too strong to ignore. Blood ran deep in houses like these. "Doesn't fit," murmured Inspector Halstead, gesturing to a portrait set apart from the others. "Simeon Everleigh. What's he doing here?" The plaque was tarnished, the frame slightly askew. Adelaide stepped closer, fingers tracing a faint groove along its edge, a pressure point. A trick of craftsmanship. With a soft click, the portrait swung outward, revealing a narrow passage cut into the wall. She exhaled. "Well, isn't that convenient?" Halstead let out a low whistle. "Hidden doors. This house is practically confessing." A cool breath of air seeped from the passage, damp with the scent of old stone and forgotten things. The dust lay thick, undisturbed except for a single trail of footprints. "Not fresh," Halstead murmured, crouching to examine them, "but recent enough." Cobwebs stretched across the entrance, delicate gossamer strands disturbed only as they stepped forward. The walls closed in, rough stone grazing their shoulders. The candle threw erratic shadows that danced along the narrow confines, shifting like figures whispering in the dark. "Servants' tunnels," Halstead muttered, voice hushed. "Back when houses like this ran on whispers and silver trays." "They still do," Adelaide said, stepping carefully over an uneven floorboard. "The silver just changes hands." Then movement, not sound, not breath, just the unsettling certainty of something having shifted beyond sight. Halstead stiffened. "Did you see?" "Yes," Adelaide murmured. The air carried the weight of presence. Something watched, something waited. She crouched, fingers ghosting over the floor, coming away with a frayed edge of dark fabric. "Men's suiting," she murmured, rolling the texture between her fingers. "Quality cloth, worn at the edges." Halstead's jaw tightened. "Finley wears a suit like this." "Yes," she agreed, slipping the scrap into her pocket. "But so does half the village on Sundays." The passage sloped downward, the air thickened. Another few feet and they reached an alcove, a small space just wide enough for a person to stand, watch, listen. The stone bore scratches, deliberate markings, not decorative. "Someone's been using this," Halstead muttered, running his fingers over the grooves. Adelaide's gaze caught something lower, a smudge of ink, still fresh enough to smear beneath her glove. "The letter," she murmured. "Same ink." "Finley?" Suspicion laced Halstead's tone. "Possibly," she said, "but ink is borrowed. Motives are not." The passage ended behind a hidden panel that, when nudged, swung open into Lady Everleigh's study, her sanctuary, and now her tomb, still carrying the ghost of perfume, the faintest trace of brandy. The room remained untouched since the police sealed it. The broken teacup, still a shattered whisper on the rug. A crime scene preserved, but not at rest. Halstead's eyes scanned the chamber. "Easy to frame someone when you control the setting," he murmured. Adelaide nodded slowly. Indeed. The pieces were assembling, a puzzle shifting into something darker than expected. The secret passage was no relic of the past. It had been used. The ink, the fabric, the too conveniently placed letter. Someone had left a trail meant to be followed. Red herring, Halstead asked. She turned, meeting his gaze. Or an invitation. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane, a skeletal branch tapping against the glass like fingers drumming in quiet expectation. Thompson straightened, slipping the torn fabric into an evidence pouch, his movements precise, methodical, too deliberate, as if measuring each breath, each moment. "We're getting close," he murmured. Adelaide Thorne's lips curled in a knowing smile, sharp as the edge of a well-honed blade. "Close is when people get careless," she said. "Or desperate." The room around them held its breath, as if the very walls were listening, waiting. Then, without another word, Thompson reached for the candle, and with a single steady breath, extinguished the flame. Darkness swallowed them whole. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice a ghost of sound against the silence, "we start shaking the trees. Let's see which apples fall." The hidden passage sealed itself behind them, with a reluctant groan, wood meeting stone in a hush of finality. The house seemed to settle, exhaling into the quiet, but houses like this never truly slept. Their secrets were woven into the very mortar, pressed between floorboards, lurking in the hush between footfalls. The little Grimshaw police station reeked of damp wood, stale tobacco, and the faint ghost of too many cups of over-brewed tea. A brass clock on the wall ticked with a deliberate, almost menacing patience, marking each second between doubt and discovery. In the back room, a space more accustomed to dealing with lost pocket watches and neighborhood disputes over overgrown hedges, an oak table groaned under the weight of scattered papers, blueprints, and a thick, choking silence. Thompson rolled up his sleeves, his tie loosened and forgotten, dangling like an abandoned noose. Across from him, Adelaide sat poised, a stark contrast of control and calculation. Her coat was draped over the chair's back, her gloves neatly folded beside a notebook, filled with annotations sharp enough to carve through falsehoods. "Let's untangle this," Thompson said, rubbing his temples, "before the whole damn village convinces itself ghosts did it." Adelaide's eyes glimmered with something unreadable. "Ghosts, Inspector? I thought you didn't believe in fairy tales." "I don't," he grunted, "but I do believe people will tell themselves anything to sleep at night." On the table, the forged letter lay exposed, its ink still dark, the words too theatrical, too perfectly constructed to be real. Beside it, a torn scrap of wool fabric, edges frayed from force, not wear, recovered from the hidden passage. Architectural blueprints of Everleigh Manor sprawled across the wood, their curling parchment edges revealing a network of clandestine corridors that twisted through the estate, like veins through a body. Scrawled notes, names, motives, alibis, fragments of truth, waiting to be stitched together. Thompson tapped the letter with 2 fingers. "Finley's handwriting is close, but Peterson from the library swears the strokes are off. Says whoever wrote this tried too hard to mimic Reginald's style." Adelaide nodded, flipping the letter over, fingers skimming its surface like reading Braille. "A forgery meant to be found isn't just about the handwriting," she murmured. "It's about the performance, theatrics, timing, placement." Her gaze drifted to the blueprints, "which brings us to the passage. Why there? Why not leave the letter somewhere simpler?" "To frame Reginald," Thompson said. "Obvious, isn't it?" "Yes," she agreed, "but obvious doesn't always mean correct." She leaned forward, tracing a thin fingertip along the inked lines of the hidden corridors, and then the fabric. Wool, good quality, common enough. But the color and weave. Thompson flipped through the photographs until he found the one he was looking for, a garden party, captured in stark black and white. "Lady Beatrice," he said, tapping the image. "That coat." Adelaide exhaled, tilting her head slightly. "Convenient. Or too convenient." Thompson sighed, leaning back. "You think she's being framed? She's proud, not careless," Adelaide mused. "Prideful people don't leave breadcrumbs, unless they want someone to follow." The silence between them stretched, thick with thought, the weight of possibilities pressing down. Outside, the village had settled into its nighttime hush, lanterns dimmed, doors bolted. The wind rattled against window panes, whispering through the empty streets, carrying truths no one wanted to speak aloud. Thompson's knuckles rapped against the table in a slow, steady rhythm. Finley had a motive, money troubles. Beatrice had one too, inheritance. Penelope, she was loyal to Eleanor, but that doesn't translate to murder. Adelaide's expression didn't shift. Sometimes, loyalty turns to something else, something bitter. Thompson exhaled sharply through his nose. All right, let's consider opportunity. Finley knew the house, knew about the passage. Beatrice knew too, but she's always been more. He hesitated. Direct, Adelaide finished. And Reginald, she studied the ink stains on the desk, the shattered teacup still lying where it had fallen in Lady Eleanor's study. Reginald is too transparent, she said. Guilt sits heavy on his shoulders. But guilt is not the same as murder. Her lips pursed slightly. Though he does make an awfully convenient scapegoat. A pause, then Thompson gestured at the table, at the evidence, at the puzzle still waiting to be solved. Everything points to, a sharp knock at the door cut through the quiet. Both of them turned. The station had been empty when they arrived. And yet, the knock came again, slow, measured, deliberate. Outside the wind howled through the narrow streets, but inside, something heavier settled into the air. Something unseen, watching, waiting. Adelaide exhaled, smiled faintly. Well, she murmured, isn't that interesting? Inspector Thompson straightened, slipping the torn fabric into an evidence pouch with a deliberate motion, his voice carrying the weight of nearing revelation. We're getting close, he murmured. Miss Marple's smile was thin, knowing. Close is when people get careless, or desperate. The room around them held its breath, shadows stretching as if listening. Then without ceremony, Thompson exhaled and extinguished the candles, plunging them into thick darkness. Tomorrow we shake the trees, he said, voice steady, and see which apples fall. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the shattered teacup, the ink stain bleeding across the desk, the concealed passage barely hidden behind them. So many fragments, yet the pattern was emerging, threads tightening, knots forming. As they stepped into the corridor, the passage sealed itself behind them with a reluctant creak, the manor exhaling, as if settling back into its secrets. But the house was never truly quiet. Houses like this never were. The Hemsby police station smelled of damp wood, stale tobacco, and the ghosts of too many overbrewed teas. A brass clock on the wall ticked with relentless precision, marking each second stretched taut between doubt and discovery. In the back room, a space more accustomed to handling lost umbrellas than murder, the oak table groaned beneath the weight of scattered blueprints, case files, and something less tangible possibility. Thompson rolled up his sleeves, his tie loosened into a forgotten noose of exhaustion. Across from him, Miss Marple sat poised, her coat draped neatly over her chair, gloves folded with quiet precision. Her notebook lay open, pages filled with script sharp enough to carve through deception. Let's make sense of it, Thompson muttered, rubbing his temples, before the whole village convinces itself that ghosts did it. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Ghosts, Inspector. I thought you didn't believe in fairy tales. Don't, he grunted, flipping through the photographs, but I do believe people will tell themselves anything to sleep at night. The evidence lay before them, the forged love letter, its ink still dark and theatrical in sentiment, the scrap of torn wool fabric, found in the manor's hidden passage, the aging blueprints of Hensley Manor, their curling parchment edges, revealing the intricate, clandestine veins of passageways running through the estate. Handwritten notes, names, motives, false alibis, each a fragment waiting to be stitched into a coherent truth. Thompson tapped the letter. Finley's handwriting is close, but Petton from the library swears the strokes are off. Says whoever wrote this was trying too hard to mimic Reginald's style. Miss Marple nodded. A forgery meant to be found isn't just about handwriting, it's about timing, placement, theatricality. Her fingers traced the hidden corridors on the blueprint. Which brings us to the passage. Why stage the letter there? Why not somewhere more natural? To frame Reginald, Thompson said, brow furrowed. Obvious, isn't it? Yes, Miss Marple murmured, but obvious doesn't always mean correct. Her eyes flicked to the scrap of fabric. Good quality wool, not uncommon, but the color and weave are distinctive. Thompson shuffled through the photographs until he found one of Lady Beatrice at the garden party, a dark wool coat draped over her shoulders. He frowned. Matches hers, convenient, Miss Marple mused. Perhaps too convenient. Thompson sighed. You think she's being framed? She's proud, not careless, Miss Marple said. And prideful people don't leave breadcrumbs unless they want someone to follow. Silence thickened between them, the weight of possibilities pressing in. Outside, the village settled into its nighttime hush, lanterns dimming, doors bolting against both the cold and the truth. Thompson's knuckles rapped against the table. Finlay had motive, money troubles. Beatrice had motive, inheritance. Penelope, he hesitated. She had loyalty to Eleanor, but that doesn't translate to murder. Miss Marple's voice was soft. Sometimes loyalty curdles into something far worse. A pause, then, let's consider opportunity. Finlay knew the house. He knew the passage existed. Beatrice knew too, but she's always preferred direct methods. And Reginald? Thompson asked. Too transparent, Miss Marple replied. His guilt is a mask for shame, not murder. Her lips pursed. Though he makes a convenient scapegoat, Thompson exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. Everything points to Beatrice or Finlay, perhaps both. Miss Marple's voice remained measured. Or perhaps we've been looking at it from the wrong angle. Thompson frowned. How do you mean? The forgery was meant to direct attention to Reginald, yes, but also to whoever found it. People overlook the finder in favor of the accused. She glanced at her notes, and people rarely question the loyal, they question the ambitious, the indebted. Thompson's brow furrowed. Penelope. She had access, she had proximity, and she had reason. Lady Eleanor's protection was both a gift and a prison. Freedom, Miss Marple murmured, can be a powerful motive. Thompson leaned back, exhaling. So what you're saying is the sweet, quiet companion forged a letter, used the passage, and staged the whole thing. Miss Marple's voice remained steady. I'm saying people aren't always what they seem. She paused. Penelope loved Eleanor, yes, but love, when twisted by control and resentment, becomes something else entirely. Thompson rubbed his face. Christ, I thought this was a simple case. It never is, Miss Marple said, her gaze returning to the table. The puzzle was no longer missing pieces, only waiting to be arranged correctly. The brass clock ticked on. Time pressed forward. Truth waited. Thompson leaned in, voice low. We confront them tomorrow. Tomorrow, Miss Marple agreed, closing her notebook with a decisive snap. The picture is nearly complete. Their eyes met across the cluttered table, a shared understanding passing between them. They were close. The kind of close that made people dangerous. The kind of close that drew out desperation and mistakes. One last piece, she said softly, hidden in plain sight. Outside, the village sign swayed in the wind, creaking like old bones settling. Inside, two investigators sat in a room heavy with secrets, staring at fragments of lies, waiting for morning. When dawn came, there would be no more hiding, not for anyone. The courtroom carried the scent of old wood and older secrets, the kind that clung to the walls and whispered through the silence between heartbeats. Rows of villagers filled the benches, their eyes hungry for drama, their breaths shallow with anticipation. At the center, beneath the weight of the chandeliers that had seen decades of trials, sat Victor Blackwood, once a man of wealth and charm, now a hollowed figure, whose hands trembled against the polished surface of the dock. The prosecutor, a tall man with a voice sharp enough to cut glass, lifted a sealed envelope between gloved fingers. "This," he declared, "is the final piece. A letter found in the study of the deceased, written by your hand. Do you deny it?" The jury leaned forward, heads bending like scholars deciphering ancient scripture. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Victor's jaw tightened. "I did not write it." His voice, hoarse but unyielding, echoed against the high ceiling. The prosecutor smirked. "Yet the handwriting matches. The ink fresh, the words damning." He turned to the jury, a confession in sentiment, if not in ink. Gasps fluttered through the crowd. In the third row, Eleanor Graves, sharp-eyed, hands still over her knitting, watched. Lies lived in voices, but truths breathed in the spaces between them. The witnesses came, one after another, each playing their role with the precision of a stage performance. Lady Eleanor Carrington, her posture regal, her voice clipped, spoke of Victor's recklessness, how her sister had been too blind to see the danger. Then came Edward Hollis, the butler, who claimed to have found the letter folded inside the desk drawer. No fingerprints, no sign of disturbance, just there, waiting to be discovered. And then Penelope Ward, the quiet lady's companion, her voice soft but her words firm, declared, "He used Lady Isabel's kindness. He twisted it." Her hands folded in her lap, barely moved, except for the right, where her fingers twitched, barely noticeable but telling. The defense struck back. No direct evidence, no undeniable proof. An affair, the defense scoffed. A staged piece of evidence. A man's life hinges on handwriting that can be imitated, and a story woven from whispers. But whispers had power, and suspicion was heavier than chains. Victor's face betrayed nothing, yet when Eleanor Graves caught his gaze, she saw the frayed edges of a man unraveling. The judge's gavel struck. Final arguments tomorrow. The courtroom emptied, voices spilling into the corridors like the tide retreating, but Eleanor remained, fingers tapping against the wooden armrest. Something didn't fit. The pieces, scattered, hinted at a shape not yet formed. Outside, the wind howled through the streets, twisting through the lamplights, carrying the weight of a secret unspoken, and in the cold hush of night, a single page, torn from a journal, fluttered under the courthouse door. 6 words scrawled in ink, smudged at the edges. "Look beyond what is meant to be seen." Eleanor's lips curled, the thrill of the hunt settling into her bones. Tomorrow, the truth would rise, whether anyone wanted it or not. The courtroom held its breath, the air thick with the scent of varnished wood, old paper, and quiet desperation. Spectators leaned forward on creaking benches, drawn like moths to the flame of scandal. Every case had its moments, but this had captured the town in a grip, colder than the November wind rattling against the courthouse windows. At the defense table sat William Ashford, a man of once unshakable presence, now frayed at the edges, his hands clasped tight to still the tremor beneath his skin. Across from him, the prosecutor, sharp-eyed and predatory, lifted a document for all to see. "This letter, Mr. Ashford," he began, his voice silk stretched over steel, "was found in the late Miss Harrington's study." The ink barely dried, the words, damning. A hush fell. The letter, its edges curled with haste, spoke of betrayal, of debts unpaid, not just in coin, but in blood. And yet, the prosecutor continued, eyes locked on the accused, "You deny writing it?" Ashford exhaled sharply. "I do." His voice, hoarse but unwavering, echoed beneath the high ceiling. A rustle through the jury, doubt, intrigue. The prosecutor tilted his head, a smirk ghosting his lips. "Then how do you explain this?" He turned the document, a signature, a match to Ashford's own, according to expert analysis. The jury's whispers were low but unmistakable. The defense rose, steady, deliberate. "Forged," he stated simply. The handwriting similar, yes, but not his. No proof he placed it there. The judge hummed, unconvinced. Proceed. And so the witnesses paraded forth, each spinning their tale with careful inflection. Miss Evelyn, the housekeeper, her voice brittle as dead leaves, spoke of hushed arguments in the corridors, of papers burned in the study's fireplace just a night before the tragedy. Then James Duval, the solicitor, sweating under the weight of unseen knowledge, revealed a new amendment to Miss Harrington's will, one that shifted the bulk of her estate to Ashford, signed mere days before her untimely death. The gallery gasped. The defense countered. Convenient, isn't it? The lawyer challenged, stepping forward, the floorboards groaning beneath his measured steps, that this document surfaces now, that our victim, known for her keen sense of caution, would change her will without informing her closest confidants. Silence. Then Penelope Graves took the stand, her porcelain composure betraying a flicker of something deeper, fear perhaps. Miss Harrington trusted Mr. Ashford, she said, voice even but her hands clasped too tightly in her lap. She confided in him. A pause, a shift in her gaze. But she feared him too. The words hung, a blade suspended over the courtroom. Ashford flinched, barely. The defense bristled. Objection, overruled. The jury absorbed it all, and then a stir from the back. A woman in a simple blue coat, unremarkable to the untrained eye, but to those who knew, the keen mind of Eleanor Whitmore, a private investigator with a reputation for seeing what others missed. She stepped forward, a single envelope in hand. "Your Honor," she said, voice smooth but charged with something electric, "I believe this will shed new light." The courtroom held its breath. The judge gestured, "Proceed." She unfolded the letter with precision. This was not written by Miss Harrington, nor by Mr. Ashford, but by someone with just as much to lose. She turned, "Mr. Duval," she addressed the solicitor, whose face had gone pale, sweat beading at his temple, "You miscalculated. The ink is indeed fresh, but the handwriting, though deliberately altered, bears one fatal mistake." She held up another document, a slip of the pen, identical to one in your own legal drafts. A gasp. Duval's breath hitched. That's absurd." But his voice shook, and the weight of the room crushed down on him. Eleanor stepped closer. "You forged the will, you placed the letter. You knew Miss Harrington would never willingly grant Ashford her fortune, but if he were convicted, the original inheritance, the one you manipulated years ago, would remain intact, with you as its executor." The silence was suffocating. The judge's gavel struck once. "Bailiff." The word alone sealed it. Duval wilted. The courtroom erupted, voices cascading over each other. Ashford exhaled, tension unraveling in real time. Eleanor merely stepped back, the thrill of the unraveling settling into her bones. Outside, the village clock struck noon. Justice, after all, had its own way of keeping time. The courtroom was a held breath, stretched thin between disbelief and the weight of something inevitable. Dust floated in shafts of light from high windows, the sound of a distant clock ticking like a slow metronome, counting down to ruin. The judge, his robes weighted with authority, regarded Eleanor Whitmore with a measured nod. "Proceed." She adjusted her gloves, her sharp eyes sweeping across the gathered faces, noting the tension coiled in shoulders, the way hands gripped the edge of benches like lifelines. At the defense table, Edmund Blackwood sat stiff-backed, his once unshakable confidence eroded to a mere facsimile of composure. Across from him, the prosecutor leaned forward, predatory, fingers steepled, but Eleanor wasn't looking at them. Her gaze flicked instead to Lydia Moreau, seated with a stillness that spoke of carefully contained panic, to James Holloway, whose hands trembled despite his efforts to still them, to Beatrice Fane, whose lips curled at the edges in a smirk that never reached her eyes. Eleanor's voice was calm, but it carried like a knife through silk. "We like our villains obvious, our crimes tidy. A man accused, a forged confession, an easy narrative, but crimes like people are rarely simple. A rustle swept through the gallery, restrained but palpable. The murder of Evelyn Lockwood was staged to mislead, to point us in the direction of an easy answer. Poison in a wine glass, a final note scrawled in trembling hand, a staged suicide. But the glass was set too neatly on the table, the ink of the letter smudged in a way that suggests it was written not in distress, but under duress. The prosecutor stirred. Circumstantial, he said, but his voice lacked the usual certainty. Eleanor merely tilted her head, and yet she continued, drawing a folded paper from her coat. This letter, written weeks prior by Miss Lockwood, tells a different story. A letter in which she confided a growing fear, not of Edmund Blackwood, as we were led to believe, but of someone far more insidious. She unfolded the letter, reading with careful deliberation. I have seen the way she watches me, the way her smiles never quite reach her eyes. I fear my own home is no longer my own. The room exhaled a collective gasp. Lydia Moreau's face had gone impossibly pale. Miss Moreau, Eleanor addressed her directly, you were the only other person in that house the night Miss Lockwood died. You testified that you were asleep, and yet the housekeeper reported hearing footsteps long after the household should have been still. A beat, and the poison belladonna, mixed into the wine, was found in a vial hidden in the drawer of your writing desk. Lydia's lips parted, closed. That's a misunderstanding. Eleanor's voice was almost kind. Then perhaps you can explain why your gloves found in the scullery bore traces of the same substance. Silence pressed in, thick, suffocating. The prosecutor turned sharply. Is this true? Lydia's composure cracked. A single splintering fault line. You didn't mean for her to die, Eleanor offered, stepping forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor, only to suffer, to force her into retreat, into reliance on you. Lydia's breath hitched, her eyes darting to Beatrice Fane, who sat with a gaze unreadable. Eleanor didn't miss it, or was it not your plan at all? Her attention shifted, cutting through the room like the edge of a blade. Miss Fane, she continued, and this time, Beatrice's smirk faltered, it was your idea, wasn't it? A slow poisoning, drawing out Evelyn's suffering just enough to make her malleable, enough to force her into a desperate act, an act you could manipulate. The weight of the accusation settled heavily. You stood to gain after all. If Evelyn's engagement was broken, if she was made dependent, the inheritance, the house, everything she once controlled, would be within reach. A sharp inhale, the trap set so delicately, snapped shut. Lydia let out a strangled breath, and then, she told me it wouldn't kill her. The words burst out, a desperate plea, her voice high, fractured. She said it would only make her weak, just enough to make her reconsider leaving, just enough to keep her here. But then, her gaze darted to Beatrice, wide with something like betrayal. But then you switched the dose, didn't you? You made sure she wouldn't recover. The room erupted, gasps, a commotion of voices, the gavel's sharp crack, barely cutting through the storm. Beatrice sat back, chin lifting, but the smirk was gone. I have nothing to say, she murmured, but her hands were trembling. The judge's voice, heavy with finality, rang through the space. This court is adjourned pending immediate arrest. The words sealed it. The tension snapped, uncoiling in gasps, in whispered accusations. Reporters scrambled for their notebooks, the rustle of skirts and shifting feet filling the space where silence had reigned moments before. Eleanor stepped back, the thrill of unraveling settling into her bones. Beside her, Inspector Hale let out a low whistle. You never cease to surprise, he murmured. She merely smiled, tucking her gloves neatly into place. People show you who they are, she said softly. If you watch long enough. Outside, the village clock struck noon, and the first flurries of winter danced in the crisp air, settling over a world forever changed. The courthouse emptied in a slow shuffling exhale, a tide of hushed whispers and stolen glances, as if the very walls had absorbed too many secrets, and now breathed them back out. Outside, Dusk pooled in the cobbled streets, the last remnants of daylight stretching long shadows from the iron gas lamps that flickered to life, their glow trembling against the damp air. The wind carried the scent of rain and something deeper, something unsettled. Eleanor Blackwood adjusted her gloves as she stepped into the chill, her sharp eyes sweeping the thinning crowd, noting the way people moved, how they clustered, some in relief, others in barely contained dread. Behind her, the courthouse doors swung shut with a weighty finality, sealing inside the echoes of revelation, of guilt unfurled like a slow-burning fuse. Edmund Caldwell had left first, his steps brisk, jaw tight, as though he could outrun the accusations that had only narrowly missed him. He had not been guilty, but innocence had brushed too close against ruin, and that left a mark. Beatrice Langley, however, had walked with the deliberate grace of a woman who refused to acknowledge the gallows closing in, though her fingers had twitched, betraying a mind scrambling for a foothold. And Lydia Harrow, our Lydia, whose trembling hands had given her away long before her voice cracked, had crumbled under the weight of the truth, led away pale-faced, shoulders drawn tight with the knowledge that her part in this would not be forgiven. But it was James Holloway that Eleanor watched the longest. He had remained motionless as the verdict fell, the pieces slotting into place with a dreadful, inexorable clarity. His eyes, so carefully blank during the trial, had flickered only once when Eleanor spoke his name, when she had turned the final key in the lock of his deception. He had underestimated her. They always did, until they didn't. A sharp gust of wind lifted the hem of her coat as she moved down the steps, the sound of her heels tapping steady against the stone, rhythmic, unhurried. Inspector Hale fell into step beside her, his face lined with something that could have been admiration, or exhaustion, or both. "That was quite a performance," he murmured, pulling his coat tighter against the cold. "I only pointed out what was always there," she replied. "People show you the truth, if you know how to look. And what do you think will happen to them?" She considered this. "The law will do what it must. But justice," her gaze drifted toward the manor on the far hill, its silhouette jagged against the darkening sky, its windows black and empty. "Justice is another matter entirely. The case had been about more than a single crime. It always was. Murder was never a solitary act. It was the ripples that came after, the slow unraveling of everything people thought they knew. Evelyn Harrow's death had been calculated, precise, designed not just to kill but to frame, to manipulate, to shape the world in someone else's image. The arsenic in her tea had been merely the final touch. The true weapon had been whispers, planted doubts, letters left where they were meant to be found. It had nearly worked. Nearly. "Holloway's not done fighting," Hale muttered, nodding toward where the man still stood, lingering at the far end of the square, his posture coiled tight with something unreadable. "They never are," Eleanor said lightly. "Desperation clings. And you?" He studied her, curiosity threading through his voice. "Will you sleep soundly tonight?" She tilted her head, considering. Perhaps. The wind carried the distant tolling of the village bells, marking the hour, and for the first time in weeks the town would settle into the comfort of its routines. Gossip would shift, twisting like ivy to new subjects, gardens, the coming rain, the price of bread. But there would always be whispers, lingering questions in the corners of parlors and behind drawn curtains. Because houses held their stories, and some doors once opened, never truly closed. Eleanor reached her home as the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping softly against the windows, tracing silvered patterns against the glass. The fire had been lit in the hearth, casting flickering warmth against the walls. She set her gloves aside, unpinned her hat, and for a moment, simply breathed. The weight of the case would linger, as they all did, settling into the quiet spaces of her mind. Justice had been served, but it never quite felt like victory, not when the truth left ruin in its wake. The kettle whistled, steam curling into the air, a moment of quiet. A pause between storms, Because in places like this, the past never stayed buried for long, and there would always be another letter, another knock at the door, another story waiting to be unraveled. But for tonight, there was only tea and firelight, and the steady click of knitting needles in the dark.